Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, How to Design for Special Events under the Ontario Building Code. My name is Shalika Sivathasan, and I am the Administrative Assistant in the Continuing Education Department at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and who are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. Kindly note that the chat function has also been deactivated. However, we do highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit any questions you have for our speaker there. Questions will be addressed during the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your OAA transcript. Please just allow a few weeks for the processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that our presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. Now, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for today's session, Megan Nicoletti. Megan has extensive experience with building code and fire code reviews for architects, engineers, designers, developers, and building owners. She is proficient in all scales of commercial, residential, infrastructure, transit, and public sector projects, both in Canada and internationally. Megan is also an active participant in the development of numerous fire and life safety standards through UL and is a regular speaker at industry events and conferences. So please join me in welcoming Megan Nicoletti. Welcome.
Thank you, Shalika. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm very excited about today's presentation because it's a little bit unorthodox in terms of just general application of the building code. So thank you all for participating today. Just to go through some of the learning objectives, I wanted to kind of recap those and what our goals are for today. So today our learning objectives are to understand the construction requirements of the OBC and how they relate to occupancy risks. This is more in a general term for purposes of this presentation. And then we're going to understand what temporary is. I'm sure you've heard this word come up often in your designs, and I want to just kind of emphasize on how we would approach this from a building code perspective. I'm also going to speak at a very high level to the change of use requirements under Part 10 and Part 9 and how we would apply those to the temporary construction and how to use other resources and other documents to kind of facilitate a safe design. So those are our learning objectives for this presentation. But to speak to our presentation today, I reiterate, we're going to cover what is temporary. This is a very common question, so we'll go through that. And then I'll speak to how we apply the building code and the fire code to these temporary construction. We're going to speak to what a life safety study is. And then I'm going to walk you through a case study that we were involved in that'll hopefully tie everything together and give you kind of that lived experience so that you can understand how we regulate these temporary facilities and events and some of the risks that we need to consider for that. So let's jump right in here and let's speak to what is temporary. So I've pulled just the definition from Merriam-Webster, and temporary is defined as lasting for a limited time and or one serving for a limited time. So the key word here is time. So temporary is considered a moment in time. However, from the building code perspective and from the authorities having jurisdiction, the concern is what is temporary in terms of its longevity. Temporary could mean 1 week. Temporary could mean 1 month. Temporary could be 1 year. And the risks that we have to assume is there's no enforcement body behind the removal of these temporary facilities or temporary events. So if there's nobody there to regulate its removal or its duration, then how do we design for it? So people often think that temporary is kind of a grace in terms of putting in more permanent infrastructure because it's only temporary. It'll only be up for a week. What's the risk? But the risk is that who's responsible for ensuring that those timeframes are met, that structure that was only supposed to be there for a week or that event that was only supposed to occur once is not repeated. And the onus falls back to the local jurisdictions to regulate that. And they don't necessarily have the client or the personnel to enforce that. So oftentimes we will see local building and fire services assess these facilities as permanent structures. Well, that's okay, but how do we design for temporary structures and events that actually don't fit well into our building codes? Our building codes don't even speak to events. They speak to buildings. So how do we design for that? So let's think of some temporary requirements that, or some temporary facilities, just to give you an example to kind of lay the groundwork and the framework. These are ones that I've actually worked on through CodeNext, and these are ones that we have kind of deemed temporary, and then we'll run a poll at the end. So some common examples of temporary construction is the pandemic hospital tents. All across Ontario during the COVID pandemic, we constructed these temporary kind of sprung structures or tensile fabric tent structures to expand those hospital networks into a tent. Another common example would be construction site trailers, right? When we're building our buildings, we pull in a construction site trailer, it anchors, it becomes the office for the contractor. So are those defined as buildings? Circus tents and wedding tents. So if you think of like a circus tent, like Cirque du Soleil will often pop up in a parking lot. These are very large tents. Or you have a wedding event where they erect a large tent. Carnivals, again, temporary in nature. They have a set duration of time. We have the booths, those game booths that you could participate in, or we often have rides. Concerts, great example. We have World Cup coming to BMO Field out in Toronto, and that is erecting temporary bandstands and seating. We will often see some of our public park spaces being used for concerts, and they'll erect some temporary staging to support that. Construction hoarding is another temporary condition where we need to protect the occupants, say, of a sidewalk, so we're going to construct some hoarding to go with that. Seasonal patios. Our Canadian climates don't typically warrant the use of outdoor patio space in winter, so we often deem these as seasonal. Well, seasonal is kind of analogous to a temporary condition. And then temporary storage areas. Oh, you've got this big empty room. Let's just put some storage stuff in there. So these are all situations in which we could fit temporary to, or we could label as temporary. But I'm going to take a poll. So we're going to run a poll, and I want everybody to weigh in on what you think of the above doesn't really fit the language of the code well, and that we don't really have any regulating guidelines to follow. So of those, which one do you think would not be regulated well under the building code? And we'll give everybody a couple minutes to run through that poll. So again, which one is not regulated well under the building code? Again, coming at it from the lens that the city's going to be looking at these as permanent structures. So they're going to want some form of guideline or prescriptive requirements, then they will regulate the use and the occupancy and the construction of these facilities or events. Okay, we'll give you about 15 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, get those answers in. 2, 1. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so it looks like seasonal patios is the winner. Most people think seasonal patios are not regulated by the building code, 29%, followed by carnival booths or rides, then construction site trailers, and then pandemic hospital tents. And temporary storage areas was deemed the most appropriately governed by the building code. So that's great. I like to see that dilution of answers. The correct answer is the pandemic hospital tents. Straight up under the building code, you are not allowed to put a hospital in a tent. A hospital has to be in a non-combustible building, and these tents, fabric tensile membrane structures, are typically considered combustible. So there were a lot of risks associated with the development of these pandemic hospital tents that we had to engineer. We had to come up with a safe solution that didn't fit any of the requirements of the building code in order to deem that these patients would be adequately protected. So the correct answer for this is pandemic hospital tents. But just to give a little bit of background as to why some of the other ones actually do fit in the building code, I'll give you a bit of context. So for those construction site trailers, oftentimes they're pulled in, they are on wheels and they're pulled in, and then the wheels are either hoarded in or they are shipping containers that don't have wheels. So they are kind of anchored to site, the duration of which could be 6 months, 1 month, 1 year. Demonstration suites are also kind of equivalent. But from the city's perspective, these are no different than a Part 9 building. And so the fact is that they could have a fire event in them. They will contain an occupancy. So we would deem them as equivalent to a Part 9 building, and we would design them accordingly. That includes everything from washroom access to barrier-free design. The only requirement that we could argue where construction site trailers are not regulated by the building code is if those wheels remain. So if they are towed in, they are on wheels or a trailer, and the point where the fire department is able to actually tow it off site. So we don't have any decking that's going to enclose or restrict the towing of that construction site trailer, in which case then we could form an argument that a construction site trailer is not actually a building, it's a vehicle, and in which case it's not regulated by the building code. But as it stands, a construction site trailer, a typical CCAN, could be considered equivalent to a Part 9 building, and we would be obligated to design it as such. Circus tents and wedding tents, under OBC section 314, there's actually very prescriptive requirements for tents of a certain size, or if they're of a smaller scale, their spacing if they're too closely together. So there are very specific requirements for tents, so these do fit well into our building code. For the carnivals, the booths and tents, the rides themselves are actually not regulated by our building code, but the booths for gaming, those could be considered Part 9 buildings. Now, there are exemptions if they're small enough that they aren't regulated by the requirements of the building code under the Building Code Act, in which case then, yes, the building code would not be applicable. But carnival rides and booths could be deemed as buildings, or at least the booths could be considered as buildings and designed for Part 9. I will emphasize that I have done a few buildings where we've actually put a ride in a building or an attraction. I was part of the Flyover Canada project, which put an attraction in a building. I also worked on a project out in Macau that put a Ferris wheel into the facade of the building. In which case we leaned on NFPA standards, which actually do deal with special amusements and attractions in buildings. So there are prescriptive requirements under building codes, just not in Canada. But for the rides and booths, at least the booths, we could consider them Part 9 if they were of a certain size. For concert sporting events, there is actual requirements under the new building code. So 2024 introduced the section 317 for demountable stages and structures. And there are also seating requirements in the building code for assembly occupancies under subsection 332. So even though these may be temporary, there are prescriptive requirements in the building code that we could follow for these temporary structures for concerts and seating events. Construction hoarding is not actually regulated in our building code. In the past, it used to be under the National Building Code. There were requirements under Part 8 for temporary hoarding, temporary construction and demolition. That was subsequently removed under future editions of the National Building Code because the requirements for construction hoarding really do fall to the contractor and or the developer under their life safety plan. But that being said, we still have to be mindful of some of the risks associated with a construction site. We want to ensure that we're going to protect, especially if we have those kind of spaces that where we're demising and we still have a portion of the building that is occupied. We want to make sure that we protect those occupants in those buildings and remove them from the risks associated with the construction site. So there are still some requirements such as egress and exit requirements that we want to make sure we comply with to ensure that we've reduced the level of risk associated with these construction sites. Seasonal patios is great. I'm happy to see that we got a good amount of people who thought that these were exempt from the building code, but these are actually covered by the building code. Oftentimes they are enclosed spaces. They will have a roof system, which means we have to extend our sprinkler systems out to service them because we have combustible content below. The cities will often deem these as just an extension of your interior space. There is a good opportunity that you have patrons. If it were, say, a restaurant, you would have patrons inside and outside. So for purposes of occupant load, we have to consider everybody and we have to count those persons that are inside as well as outside. They're deemed simultaneous and not non-simultaneous. So we want to make sure that we still have sufficient number of exits to accommodate the full occupant load of that suite, as well as sufficient washroom spaces. So patios are regulated, especially in terms of occupant load. And then for temporary storage, again, these are, we still have to be mindful of kind of the egress requirements associated with them under building code, but these are also regulated under the fire code. So fire code is going to have some requirements such as, if we're storing dangerous goods in these spaces, how do we regulate those? So now everybody hopefully has an understanding and you're starting to think of what we would consider temporary and how we're starting to fit these temporary requirements into our building codes and our fire codes. But let's go back and actually figure out how we apply the building code to some of these requirements. So I'm going to go a little bit fundamental here, but bear with me because hopefully it'll all kind of come together as we get through to that case study. So we're going to speak to the building code and the fire code application. So generally speaking, the OBC is your design tool. It's going to prescribe you the construction requirements that are particular to that occupancy type and the geometry of the building. It's going to tell you how you can build your building safely. It sets the minimum level of safety required. You are welcome to over-design. So if your building's not required to be sprinklered, there's nothing to say that you cannot sprinkler it. You are welcome to do so. But it's going to govern the construction requirements for your building. It's going to tell you how to construct your building safely. The key thing to note is that the building code is applicable to construction, okay? So it's your kind of advisory board. It's your guidelines. It's enforceable by law, so you have to meet those requirements, but it's not retroactive, okay? That's one thing I always want to emphasize. Once the building is constructed, you can put that building code on the back burner once you've gotten your occupancy permit and it's no longer applicable to your project, okay? So with the building code, we design our spaces to ensure that all levels of risk are addressed. So each different building type and each different occupancy type has a certain level of risk that's assigned under the building code, and we have compensated construction. So we have, more conservative requirements, the greater the risk. To give an example, if we have a higher building, we might have a higher fire resistance rating. It's going to take people longer to evacuate that building if they have to come down a significant number of flight of stairs. So say a 30-story building has a very different level of risk than a 3-story building. The evacuation times are much longer. So how are we going to compensate? We're going to have an increased fire resistance rating to afford those people more time to evacuate the building. So all of our buildings are designed based on their level of risk. So I've got some here, some examples of what I would consider kind of risks for different occupancy types. If we have a school and a long-term care, what are we looking at here? We're looking at vulnerable occupants, right? We want to ensure that these people are protected. For an assembly occupancy, we've got things such as crowding, dense occupant loads. We want to make sure that we are addressing this, and maybe egress systems are a bit more robust than you would find in, say, a residential application. For our detention facilities, our group Bs, we have kind of controlled egress or containment. So these people can't just freely walk out on their own volition. We want to make sure that they are controlled in their egress and evacuation. But with that comes a certain level of risk as well. Residential, we have people who are sleeping, right? Smoke is the biggest concern for a fire event, not fire. Most oftentimes, deaths from a fire event are due to smoke inhalation. So when it comes to residential occupancies, sleeping is a big concern. And then for industrial, we often have higher combustible content or load, right? So there's a bigger propensity for a fire to grow or for it to spread. So all of these inform a certain level of risks associated with a certain occupancy type. But what if we want to use our building for a purpose that it was not originally designed for? How do we ensure that it's safe? So in order to do that, we have to kind of set our baseline. We have to set our benchmark, and we need to understand the context for what we're working with. So what systems does the building already have that are going to influence the risks associated with this new event that's going to occur in this space? So for example, if we have a building and it's low rise and it doesn't have any fire resistance rating, but now we're putting, people are going to be sleeping in this for a certain duration, temporary, we want to make sure that we're protecting those occupants because the building may not have the associated protection measures that we would expect for this specific occupancy. So oftentimes we have to understand how the building was originally designed and constructed, right? We need to know what we're working with. What does the building have? And once we understand that, then we can understand what do we need to do to complement that to ensure that this new event or this temporary space is still going to have an adequate level of protection. So what we often have to do is we have to go back and we have to look. So we're going to go and we're going to look at those old building codes. We're going to understand when this building or when this space was originally constructed, and we're going to evaluate it as if it were new back in 1977 or if it were new back in 1940. I put this slide up just to give you an idea in terms of time frame. So if you are looking at some older codes, you know which codes would be governed. So if your building was constructed or your space was constructed post 1975, and it's in an Ontario privately owned facility, it would have been regulated by the Ontario Building Code. Anything prior to that would have been constructed per the addition of the National Building Code relative at the time of permit application. So if your building was built in 1963, there was no such thing as an Ontario Building Code at that time. So it would have been designed and issued for permit under the National Building Code of record at the time of permit application. However, our National Building Code only came into effect in 1941. So before that, it was all local bylaws, and different municipalities had different bylaws that you would design your building for. So if we're going to have a temporary event or a temporary use of our space, we need to understand what we're working with. So we're going to go back to these old codes and we're going to understand, because we may be able to look at a building to determine, oh yeah, it's got 2-hour floors, but maybe it's actually 3-hour floors. So I always go back to these old codes to understand, what are we working with? Okay, what do we have in this? We assume that our buildings were built to permit, but this is going to set our benchmark and inform us on what might need to be done. What's our compensating construction or compensating requirements needed to support this new event or new use of this temporary use of this space? So our building codes inform new construction, right? But what if we're renovating an existing space? Well, in Ontario, we're blessed in the sense that we have OBC Part 10 and Part 11. These are exclusive to Ontario. I will inform that I am currently sitting on an NRC committee to draft Part 11 into the National Building Code, which is our model code. So I'm hoping that these will trickle down to other provinces, because Part 11 and Part 10 are great for working with existing infrastructure. But that being said, we have our new construction is governed under Part 3, Part 9, Part 4 of all of our building code. But oftentimes when we're considering a temporary event, we're thinking of a space that was not designed for that use. So we need to understand what the existing space was, My first step is always to look at the more robust requirements, Part 10 and Part 11 for change of use and for renovation to see what would be required to be deemed safe. So it's going to evaluate all of these different measures, and I've put them here. We have a change in major occupancy, a change in farm building to another major occupancy, where an existing early warning and evacuation systems are insufficient for new use. So those are your fire alarm systems or your exit facilities. We have insufficient fire separations between uses, or our buildings required to be non-combustible, and it's currently constructed as combustible construction. So that being said, all of these requirements really live more so with respect to if we were making this a permanent facility. These compensating measures that we have to adopt sometimes for a change of use or for a renovation are not necessarily reasonable for a temporary event. So if we were to say undergo a change of use under Part 10 or Part 11 in the building code, it may warrant that we add sprinklers to a building. It may warrant that we install a fire alarm system or a voice communication. We may have to increase our floor fire resistance ratings or our wall-to-wall fire resistance ratings due to kind of exposure between two different major occupancies. Or we may have to upgrade some of our door hardware. I hope we all know that if you have over 100 people, we need to have panic hardware on a door. So if we increase our occupant load, then we have to change all of our door hardware. But again, if we're just hosting a temporary event in this space, are we going to be able to go through and sprinkler it? What if it's a one-time event, right? We have a certain event that's going to occur once Saturday night. Are we going to go through and sprinkler this building or this space for that event? Not likely, right? Most projects probably, or events, don't have budget to do this. Perhaps they want to negotiate with the landlord on that, but that is something that's not reasonably applied for an incidental use. So our building codes don't necessarily really deal with these kind of temporary or these incidental events, right? So how do we fill that gap? Well, let's move over to the fire code and let's see if it can fill our gap. So Ontario Building Code regulates construction. Our fire code is our maintenance document. So once your building is owned and operated and constructed, you can put that building code on the back burner and our fire code comes into play. So our fire code is going to ensure that those safety measures we built into our buildings, we designed into our buildings, are enforced. You've put up a 1-hour wall to protect this space from the next space. We want to ensure that the new owner and operator is like, I don't like that wall there. I'm going to start punching holes in it. I'm going to tear it down. The fire code is the regulation that's going to say, no, that wall has to remain. You tore it down, you put it back up. Okay, so it's our maintenance document. It really lives on top of the building code in terms of it leans on ensuring that the mechanisms that were put in place on the original design are carried through the lifespan of the building. Okay, but that being said, how do we address those temporary events where, yes, our building was designed for this use, but if we're not going to use it for that use and we want to use it for something different, are we required to maintain it? So the Ontario Fire Code actually does consider special events. So we're starting to form a path now that we can lean on when we have these kind of special events through this space. So let's move over. This is what's called a life safety study. So this is the language terminology that we're going to use that's going to inform the level of risk and our compensating construction for anything that we would deem temporary, whether it be a temporary building or a temporary event in a space. I'm going to take another poll. Has anyone ever attended an event in a space in a building that they didn't think was actually originally designed for? It's just a yes or no answer, and I'll give you some examples. Have any of you ever gone to a wedding in a barn? A barn is typically a farm building, not originally designed for a wedding, which may have a lot of people in that space. Another example would be an art event in a warehouse or an industrial space. Toronto is really good at repurposing some of those old industrial spaces like the Hearn down on Toronto waterfront for a big art gallery. And have any of you participated in an office party where they're having their anniversary party and they've invited all their special clients and family and guests into this space? These people don't work in that office, and it could be in their actual office, or maybe it's down in the lobby of the building. Another requirement that another example we often see is a film set in an abandoned building or even in an occupied building that wasn't necessarily designed for a film set. So let's take a poll there quickly, yes or no. Just curious if anybody has not attended any of these events, but have you participated in an event in a building for which you think that building was not designed for? This one's a pretty easy one, so we will give you 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see. 8% of you said no. Really? I think now that I've opened your eyes, when you start looking around, you'll start thinking, right, this space is not designed for this. I was never, this event is a spin-off of what that original construction or that original occupancy is. So I'm actually surprised to see 8% of you think you've not attended a temporary event in a space that was not designed for that use, but perhaps we could maybe run this poll at the end and see if that has changed as we go through this. Okay, so now we understand kind of these events and the use and the purpose of these, but each of these events creates a risk. So let's go through and start kind of analyzing some of those risks. We understand now that buildings are designed for their specific needs, right? We've got those, assembly occupancies where we have crowd control, we have residential with sleeping, schools, we have vulnerable occupants. But if we use it for a different purpose, then we have to evaluate each of these new risks to see if they're supported by the building, right? So running through some of the anticipated risks that we would foresee, insufficient fire protection systems. That's one thing that we want to look at. So perhaps this building is unsprinklered, perhaps it doesn't have a fire alarm system, perhaps it needs one now. We're putting a lot more people into this space, or we've got a lot more storage in this space, or we've got candles on tables and we've added flames to this space, or we're barbecuing indoors. All those things, we would want to ensure that we're protecting them accordingly. And perhaps the building doesn't have sufficient fire protection systems like your sprinkler system, your fire alarm system, or even your standpipe connections for the fire department to respond to. And another one that we have to consider an increased risk would be increased in occupant load. So this space may have only been designed, if it's an old maintenance building, it may have only been designed for 10 people. And now we'll use the barn, the wedding barn example. Farm buildings are deemed low occupancy. So it's anticipated not more than typically 4 people in a farm building, in a barn. Livestock, obviously, but in this circumstance, humans, we have a very low occupant load. We're putting a wedding in there. So now we've got an increase in occupant load. The prescriptive requirements of Part 11 and Part 10 do address this under a change of use. But again, this is just a temporary event. So do we want to inherit all of those more permanent infrastructure requirements that go with an increase in occupant load? So if we can't adopt those prescriptive requirements of the building code, what are we going to do to deal with all these extra people? Another risk that we would see would be occupants not familiar with the building. So typically we design our spaces for our people. If we have an office building, you're going to have office attendees in there. You have a school, you have students. Students are fire drilled regularly, that they are well aware, probably better than most adults, on the evacuation protocol for a building. But what if we have parent-teacher night and we start bringing all those parents into that space? They may not be familiar with the building. They're not aware of the evacuation protocol, and therefore there may be a delay in egress that we would have to consider. Another concern or risk would be fire department. We always want to make sure whenever we're repurposing a space in our building that we bring the fire department on board and we inform them of all the risks, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be coming in if there is an event, and they need to know the appropriate ways to respond for this. So oftentimes these life safety studies are a negotiation with your local fire services in terms of, we respect the risks associated with, say, having an increase in occupant load. This is how we're going to address it. And local fire services are welcome to have input on that. And they may say, okay, we accept that level of risk. That deems reasonable to us. However, we would want to see this, and this. Oftentimes you'll find that these spaces, again, because they don't fit well into the building code, you almost have to get creative in terms of identifying those risks and figuring out another way. And this is our opportunity to identify the fire department, but there's not a lot of documentation to support some of these risks. Like I said, it's a bit creative, but it's about speaking with fire departments so that they can point out to you some of these risks that they foresee that you may not have thought of. So we really want to stay engaged with our fire services in terms of identifying all these available risks. They may have input that you may not have thought of. And then the final one, insufficient quantities of washrooms. I could also elaborate and say egress as well, but that could be under insufficient fire protection systems. But we want to ensure that if we're using this space, again, the wedding in the barn, a barn may not even have a washroom, because the idea is that the farmer who's using this facility would have access to perhaps the washroom in their residence. But if we're throwing a wedding, we have that one bathroom in the farmhouse. Do we want all guests and all attendees using that single stall residential washroom upstairs in their bedrooms? Perhaps not. So we have to consider what are the risks. We want to make sure that we address insufficient quantity of washrooms. Okay, so under the fire code, like I said, the fire code does address life safety studies. That's the correct terminology here. And it's prescribed under subsection 914. Really, the whole intent of these life safety studies are to ensure that our buildings are designed to accommodate the specific needs and the functions of their occupants and the use that we're proposing in there. So the fire code is going to regulate all the fire safety systems within them. A life safety study recognizes that this space may not be designed for the use that you're proposing to it, and it wants to ensure that all the fire and life safety features of this suite have been evaluated. Okay, so the purpose of our life safety study is to analyze all the fire and life safety systems against that temporary use of that space. Okay, we're going to lean into building systems, management features, everything that we will have to rely on for the safety of the occupants and the staff during that event. Okay. We have to identify any condition that may pose a risk to occupants and our recommended safety measures to reduce those associated fire and smoke hazards. Okay, so we're really looking at the dangers of these events and how we're going to address them. Again, it's a correspondence back and forth with local fire services. The fire code actually prescribes that we have to present this as a document to the chief fire official for their engagement and for their opportunity for approval. And they want a detailed assessment. Okay, and I'll get into that more as we go through, but we have to outline specifically what the event is, what the risks are, and how we're going to address them. And that'll include everything from table layouts to timeframes to how many staff are going to be hired. The other key requirement here under a life safety study under the fire code is that it must be sealed by a professional engineer, an architect, or both. So they want to ensure that we don't have just an event planner saying, yeah, I've done this 1,000 times. My events are good. I know what I'm doing. They actually want someone who's qualified preparing these plans, these life safety studies, because they want to ensure that all the risks are addressed. Okay, they want people with a certain level of experience and knowledge. So what does the fire code really ask us to evaluate? It really categorizes on 4 levels of risk. So it wants us to address suppression, detection, containment, and egress. All of these risks, though, relate to the infrastructure of the building, and they don't really delve into the particulars of the event, like guests and their demographics, the staffing levels, and the operational procedures that are going to be put into place. Again, we're just leaning on the infrastructure of the building because the building, as I said earlier, the fire code leans on the requirements that we were developed for the original building under the building code. So it's going to look at suppression, and it's going to make sure that we include content relating to that. So suppression in terms of fire department access to the building. Do we have a standpipe or sprinkler system? Are there any special suppression systems in the building? Do we have elevators for firefighter use? And all of those have to be documented because it's informing the city of what mechanisms are in place to help them with these risks. Okay. It also speaks to detection. I've attended a few events, a few architectural events actually, where they host a party in a building that's under construction. So these are construction sites. They've been cleaned up. We don't need any kind of safety PPE. But that being said, all of our smoke detectors are still hanging, right? Well, are they still operational? We have to identify that to fire services that, they will function as needed during an event. Do we have a fire alarm system even in the building? Do we have a voice communication system in the building? Containment. What if there were a fire to occur? How are we addressing that? How is the building infrastructure going to support an event in the building? Do we have fire separations? Or Is the integrity of the fire separations maintained? If it's just one half of the drywall, you don't have stud and you have exposed studs, that wall may not be deemed as a adequate fire rated separation. We're going to look at the construction assemblies. Are we non-combustible? Are we combustible? Do we have fire resistance ratings? Do we have partitions even between adjacent major occupancies? Interior finishes. This is another one. I've attended a few weddings. I've audited a few weddings in greenhouses. Our greenhouse spaces are often repurposed as beautiful wedding events. And they have, not only do they have kind of acrylic roofing systems, but then they've got this lovely greenery that they have then framed the whole space. Well, all that is combustible content that's going to contribute to a fire event in that space. So we want to be mindful of those. And then the other big thing that the fire code really, really concerns itself with is with respect to egress. We want to ensure that if there is an event in that space, that people can evacuate in a timely fashion, or are the obligations of the fire services to rescue. And these are things that we have to kind of go through on the fire code and evaluate to ensure that all of these things are addressed. And through a life safety study. And I guess I should reiterate, a life safety study is a plan. So think of it like a fire safety plan. It is a Word document that's going to go through, and they can get quite lengthy, and it's going to describe all of the situations that need to be addressed, all the operational protocol, or all of the life safety measures that have been adopted for this space, identifying all the risks and how we're responding to those risks. Again, as I get through and go through the case study, you'll perhaps better understand that. But back to the fire code. So the fire code, again, it really categorizes these in terms of the building and the infrastructure and what we have for this space. And sure, we can supplement a lot of them. If we don't have exit signs, maybe we put up temporary signs. We put up pieces of paper with high contrasting white paper, black marker, large bold lettering, and we can put up temporary signs to address some of these wayfinding measures to address some of these fire code risks. But what I often do, and this is not prescribed by the building code, this is not prescribed in Canada even, but where I find we have a big gap in terms of these temporary events and these temporary spaces is in terms of the event particulars, right? The staffing and the patrons of the event, the demographics of the event. So this is where I'm actually jumping over. And I jump into NFPA 101, which is the life safety code. Again, this is not an enforceable document in Canada. NFPA is an American standard. But that being said, it's informative. It addresses risk. It outlines them. It's very prescriptive. And it's okay to lean on another document when you're filling the gaps for where our documents are silent. Okay, so our fire codes and our building codes really address just the building and the infrastructure available. But what I like about the life safety code is that it fills the gaps in terms of the event, and it talks about the event particulars, and it provides a much more detailed description of all the different things that need to be assessed. So it's going to speak to like the nature of the event. What kind of event is it? Who are the participants? Who are the attendees? Who's going to this? Are they adults? Are they children? What level of mobility do they have? Access and egress movements, do we have a dense crowd? Do we have very few people in a very large space? Those are going to have different levels of risk that we need to assess. Are they controlled? This portion of the building is blocked off. They only have access to this area. How are we dealing with medical emergencies, right? Oftentimes these events will occur after hours or in a remote location. It may have longer response times for our EMS. So how are medical emergencies going to be addressed? Do we have a defib that we're going to put in this space? Do we have first aid kits? Those things are things that need to be considered. Fire hazards. Fire hazards with temporary events pop up all the time. So if you think we have an unsprinklered building and we have combustible construction and we don't have any working smoke detectors, do we really want to be putting in large tables with linen tablecloths and candles on those tables? And when I speak to candles, I'm talking about fire candles, not flameless candles. Obviously, a good suggestion here would be go for table linens that are maybe not so combustible, and perhaps we consider flameless candles for this event, right? We want to try and mitigate a lot of those anticipated fire hazards where our building is not really designed to support those. Permanent and temporary structural systems. So we may have some staging that gets erected, right, for this event. I've often seen, they've hoarded off certain areas of the building, or they've suspended curtains to delineate the event space from other spaces. all of those are actually addressed under NFPA 101, whereas they're not necessarily addressed in our building and fire code. Severe weather conditions. You're hosting the event and it's outside in a parquet and there is a wicked thunderstorm that comes through the space. What happens? Everybody runs for shelter. Everybody runs for cover. Well, do we have mechanisms in place to address severe weather conditions? And my case study actually speaks to this, so we'll get into that a little bit more. Earthquakes, not so prevalent in Ontario. We get small ones, perhaps in BC. Again, this is an American standard, so written for portions of the states that do receive significant earthquakes, but something to consider, right? If there's an earthquake event, what is going to be the reaction of the guest attendees, and how can we anticipate that and protect accordingly? Civil or other disturbances. We don't often like in our building codes to think of malicious intent, but it's something we should be mindful of for these temporary events, because again, we're trying to anticipate all of the foreseeable risks so that we can address them accordingly. Hazardous material incidences, if we've got, excess cleaning products left available, or, we've got propane cylinders throughout the space, or a helium tank for the clown that's making the balloon animals. All of those things we want to be mindful of, and where we store those tanks and how we use those hazardous materials. And we want to make sure that they're remote. We don't want to be blowing up balloons next to the cooking station with the barbecue, right? So we have to consider those things. And then the relationship between, the management, the participants, emergency plan response teams. We want to make sure that everybody is engaged, everybody's talking. So it's really leaning on operational protocol, and we want to make sure that those lines of communication are open to ensure that everybody is speaking to everybody, because it's really contingent on how people are going to react and how people are going to respond. So similar to how our fire codes and our building codes address it, NFPA does state specifically that fire plans should include the following requirements, and it should cover egress and exits, building details, and event layouts. So they're going to want to see that if you have an event and you've got, say, large tables for a gala, that you've kind of located those tables respectful of kind of egress pathways, right? We want to make sure people can still walk around tables, walk through tables, and that we're not affecting travel distance for those spaces. The building details, we want to outline all of those, obviously, so that fire department is aware of what systems are in the building and what they can use and what's available to them. And then egress and exit always is something to be mindful of, because typically for these kind of temporary events in a space, we don't really know how these guests are going to react, and they may not be familiar with some of the life safety systems in there and some of the available egress routes or evacuation routes. So we want to make sure that we don't delay egress because of the patrons that are visiting this space. The other thing that goes beyond, though, why I like life safety studies in the NFPA 101 requirements, is that they go beyond just kind of the building and the infrastructure requirements, because it actually does address prototype or protocol for staff and guests that aren't often considered by the Canadian codes. Specifically, it speaks to guest characteristics. So what are the demographics of our people in our space? We're going to be looking at the age, the cognizance, the physical mobility, their social affiliations. Response times, I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but response times to fire cues, when you have a very large crowd, they're actually slower. There's more happening, people are more engaged. The denser crowd, they may not be aware that there's a fire event. There's more distractions. So we often find that the fire cues are slower to be responded to in a crowded environment. Additionally, we find that then subsequently leads to delayed in evacuation times, right? So the demographics of our people is really critical. Perhaps we're catering an event to an older crowd who may not have, the mobility to evacuate quickly and are much slower traveling down a stair. All of those things need to be put into place, and how we can compensate for that is maybe we have additional staff that can assist them, right, in evacuating. More people pushing wheelchairs, perhaps. Those things all have to be mindful of. Alcohol is a big factor in a lot of these events. Typically at these special events that we're hosting, we may be serving alcohol. How is that being addressed? Because that's going to influence how people are going to react in an emergency. Obviously, their cognizance abilities to respond to a fire event are going to be much more lower when there's alcohol served and people are drinking. There's security protocol also that need to be considered. If someone is significantly inebriated, how are we going to handle that? They decided they want to climb a wall that should not be climbed, or they're traveling into a space that's not, we've hoarded off a portion of our building and they're traveling beyond it. So again, leaning on really staffing requirements on how they're going to address this. Having public or private guests or invitation only or open to the public is going to have a really big influence on some of those risks. So, people who are familiar with the building, we're all familiar with our office spaces, we're all familiar with our home environment. If we closed our eyes at home, we could probably find the front door because we've lived this experience daily. But if we're bringing in outside guests, they may not be familiar with that building. So they're going to lean more on kind of lighting, signage, wayfinding to help with an evacuation. If we have a power outage situation, most likely, perhaps those lights are not on emergency power because that building wasn't designed to have emergency power. Lights drop, what happens? All goes dark. Are these people who are not familiar with the building going to be able to evacuate? What's going to happen? And we have to think that through, and we have to build a plan on how we address it. Luckily, we live in a society where everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a flashlight. But, 20 years ago, that was not a thing. And so perhaps we put a bucket of flashlights significantly around the room with photoluminescent tape on the bucket, right? These are all little things that we can do to compensate for it. And again, I'll get to that in the case study. Invitation only, obviously we're controlling the number of people coming through this space, whereas if we have kind of open to the public, it's more anticipated that people are going to ebb and flow. They're going to come and they're going to go. So you have a portion of the event where it gets really crowded at a certain time frame, and then there's very few people. But does that mean that we can hire and fire staff accordingly? Like we're going to have peak times where we have a lot of staff and then they all take their break at the same time when we anticipate kind of an ebb in the crowd. All those things, again, have to be considered. Hours of operation and duration, going back to the alcohol, if our event is just 1 or 2 hours, then perhaps inebriation is not so much of a concern because it's such a short duration. But if this is an event that is occurring throughout the whole day or night or for a longer duration, the anticipation that inebriation may be more significant is elevated for that. Also, if the event is evening or daytime, right? If it's an evening event, do we have enough lighting? Like I said, power failure event, lights drop, what happens? It all goes dark, right? How are we going to compensate that? But if that happens now, lights fail, it doesn't go dark. We've got sunlight perhaps, so people can still find their way out. So the hours of the event are really going to influence some of those risks. In terms of staffing, we want to make sure that we have the appropriate number of staff, the appropriately trained staff, and that there's a protocol in place for them to follow. It's great to have good intentions and everybody is responsible for a fire extinguisher. Everybody's responsible for phoning fire services, but less is sometimes better than more. As we all know, what happens if everybody is equipped with walkie-talkies, the whole staff, they're communicating, and somebody spots a fire, everybody else spots a fire, and they all jump on the radio at the same time. That message may not get through to the right people because everybody's using it. So we want to make sure that we have specific protocol in place. Oftentimes you'll see an event planner will have a plan. They'll have a document that they're going to go through, and they're going to make sure that the staff know their duties, know their responsibilities, they stay in their lane, and that if anything were to happen in terms of risk, they're addressed accordingly. We often will have to lean on our staff to fill a lot of the gaps in terms of these special events because these buildings aren't designed, we may not have the fire separations needed that we would normally have. So how are we going to fill that gap? Well, maybe we have to have additional staff trained in the use of a fire extinguisher, right? Maybe it's a more remote location or the elevators are not operational because the building is under construction. So now our first aid our paramedics are now having to climb 4 flights of stairs. It's going to be slower for them to respond. So maybe our staff are trained in the use of a first aid kit or a defibrillator. We want to kind of think these through. Security is obviously something that we really want to consider, and we make sure that we have security on hand to deal with any like unauthorized entry, any alcohol abuses, any security breaches. This we can see sometimes as third-party engagement, where they'll hire a third-party security team to come in. or some events. I'm sure we've all been to a sporting event where you see local police stationed on the event floor. So you are welcome to hire emergency services to come in for your event. They get paid hourly, but that helps kind of facilitate some of the risks that we would expect for this. Staff might also be responsible for a lot of housekeeping. You know, they see napkins fall on the floor that could create a tripping hazard, they pick them up. They see someone smoking in an unauthorized area, they're informing that person that they need to relocate. Inclement weather, I spoke to that earlier. People are going to lean on the staff in terms of what they do. They'll run for shelter, but then where do they go from there? You know, what happens if the building nearby is only designed for 60 people and you have 100 people rushing in, and then public patrons of the park nearby rush in? Now we have over 100 people in this building. Maybe one of the staff protocol could be that we prop open doors that are inward swinging so that it doesn't create kind of a crush factor, right? So all of these protocols need to be documented and communicated to the full team and fire services. Another risk that often comes up is cooking, right? If we have cooking can create a fire hazard. We're cooking with fire oftentimes. We're using gas-fired appliances. So we want to make sure that where we locate this and how it's operated is done in a method that will reduce those risks, right? We don't want to put those barbecues next to the helium balloon container. We don't want to put those barbecues under a tent. We want these to be remote. We want to make sure that an adequate level of protection is there, and perhaps we have a fire extinguisher nearby. Another thing that's characteristic of these events is music, right? We'll have sometimes live music, or we will have background music, or somebody's got their Bluetooth speaker blaring in the background. But if there's an event and there's no fire alarm system in the building, and a staff member tries to fight a fire, it grows to a point, now they need to alert people to evacuate. How do they do so? How do they make that announcement? Do they shout? Is there a loudspeaker somewhere that they can grab it? Is it their duty to use the loudspeaker? What if it's across the room? Who's responsible for informing the musicians to stop playing? Is there a microphone? So all of these things are things that we get addressed through the life safety plan, and we document, right? We have to consider these risks. Another recommendation I would always suggest is, because we've engaged fire services, police, and EMS, I really highly recommend a pre-incident walkthrough. We want to make them familiar with this space, even if it's just a one-time event, because there are extra risks associated with this. We want to bring them in. We want them to walk through so that when if an event were to occur, they know how to appropriately respond. And again, this will come through a bit more in my case study. So life safety code, NFPA 101, does get quite descriptive. It's very good. It prescribes a lot of the criteria that you should consider. So we would recommend using it as a gap, or to fill the gap where our building codes and our fire codes don't necessarily address a lot of the kind of the event particulars. Another option to you is a special occasions permit. This is typically, it's filed through the local municipality. Some municipalities have it. I put a QR code to the one for Toronto. It's issued through the Alcohol and Gaming Commission. So typically it's only applicable when you have alcohol, but that doesn't mean to say you can't use it. So you are welcome to fill it out. Even if you don't have alcohol, fill it out and provide it to local fire services, because it also includes certain measures that you're going to identify as a risk item for this. So QR code, you'll be provided with a copy of the slide, so you'll have access to that. Okay, so now I'm quickly going to go through a case study that I did, and I'm hoping that this will pull everything into perspective for you, because this was a very unique event, and we had a lot of unique conditions that we had to consider for this. So our case study is for Conservation Halton. Back in 2019, I had to undertake an event for the Friluftsliv Gala. So what this is Conservation Halton's old quarry. So this was a quarry. The body of water you can see in the map is a quarry. It was accessed off a partially paved road that was 700, even more so, 700 meters long, off of Steeles Avenue out in Halton. And the building that I've circled, the yellow building, is an old maintenance shed. So this building is an industrial facility. It is non-combustible, which was a bit of a win, but it's just a large open room, and it was meant for the storage of maintenance equipment. And Conservation Halton was transitioning this old quarry space to a public park. And part of that transition was they wanted to host an opening gala to kind of cut the ribbon on opening this park and making this quarry now a public space. So through that, they invited a lot of local participants from community of Halton, the mayor. They invited a whole bunch of people to come attend this grand gala event in this maintenance building. So as you can understand, there's a lot of risks associated with this site. So the road only being partially paved. Everybody's aware there's a fire code or building code requirement that fire department access routes have to be sufficient to support a truck. Fire department trucks are very, very heavy. They will sink into mud. And I have a photo that'll show you what the site looked like, but also the distance. We also don't have water supply. Yes, we have a pond nearby, but we don't actually have a hydrant. So we don't have sufficient water supply in terms of pressure. So we have to make sure that we work with fire services and inform them that there is a lot of water available on the site, but bring a pump because you can't get a truck down to that water site. The distance, I believe, 140 meters from the pond, the building distance. So bring enough hoses and bring a pump that if we need to lean on that that quarry water for suppression of a fire, we want to make sure that the fire department brings the correct equipment. We also had to consider inclement weather. We had a thunderstorm. I attended this gala, and we actually had a thunderstorm come through the event. The event planner was quite good, and they had equipped everybody with umbrellas, so that was quite nice. But people didn't necessarily mingle where they had intended. They had proposed down on the beach. They had these large bonfires. Obviously, bonfires, from my perspective, gives me a little bit of a shiver. But we had very specific staff regulations for that in terms of how we're going to address those bonfires. Each bonfire had a staff member nearby, and we had corresponding fire extinguisher, like buckets of sand, available to them to suppress those bonfires if need be. And we made sure that they were located such there was no combustible content nearby. We didn't want those fires to grow beyond kind of the designated areas that they were assigned to. Washrooms was another issue. There were no washrooms on the site. That's an easy fix. I'm sure we've all attended it. You can bring in trailers that have washroom facilities in them. So they brought in a bank of washrooms for this site. So there were a lot of site concerns that we had to consider for this property in terms of hosting an event to this space. But there were also some really interesting event specific criteria. This was the client goal, and this is be a goal that you may receive as a designer on what they're looking for. So I pulled this off of their website, but I did want to identify some kind of key words here. This event was hosted in an industrial warehouse. It was surrounded by a beautiful landscape with elements of nature, which is great, but that means unpaved roads. They wanted to blur the lines between indoor and outdoor. And what they did was they wanted to create an indoor forest, which sounds great, but trees burn, foliage burns. So we have a significant combustible load in this space. So again, these are all things that we have to consider that, this building, this industrial warehouse maintenance building was not designed to have all these live trees in that space and all this extra combustible load and a crowd of over 100 people. So what are we going to do, and how are we going to build up a plan to address all of these kind of client desires? I've put in some kind of photographs here that were taken at the event to give you kind of an idea of what was anticipated. So some things that we regulated for this event was, biggest thing was working with the event planner to ensure that all the communication was available. So we did not have a fire alarm system for this building. So the fire department had no way of knowing if there was going to be an event in the space. So we had a responsible person, a designated staff member who was equipped with a special walkie-talkie. We had to worry about cell phones and batteries dying. We had to ensure that they were the responsible one that was going to phone fire services if the fire was detected. So that will trigger the fire department response so that they could start evacuating the people as we're waiting for fire department to respond. So that was the biggest thing, was working with them to make sure that communication was there. Everything was done by walkie-talkie. We had designated channels for certain things, and we communicated directly with local emergency services as well as internally too, because every staff had a designated role. We also determined how many staff would be needed. So we went through and said, okay, this is happening here. This is happening here. We want to make sure we have 2 staff here. We have 3 staff assigned. This event actually engaged paramedics directly for the property. So we had 2 paramedics on staff who, just sat off by the ambulance remotely, but they were available if needed. So that was not a gap that we had to fill in that sense. We did not have any cooking operations. Everything was cold food, plated food, or pre-warmed and brought into site. So there are no cooking operations that we needed to concern ourselves with. But if you look at the photo in the top right corner, candles on tables, sitting on a wood table, and we had this whole nature feel with trees. So obviously we went with flameless candles, right? We don't want to ensure that we have a fire in this space. A candle gets tipped over, it ignites the pamphlets that are on the table, which in turn ignite the table, which then spreads to the chair and the table linens, right? So we really looked to limit the combustible load of what was happening in this space and being mindful of those trees. We also wanted to make sure those trees were very well watered. We didn't want any kind of dry tinder, contributing to a fire event. Everybody is seated at tables. There was no food served at the tables. So the tables were set up. Everybody sat, everybody listened through speeches, and then the tables were essentially abandoned because there was nothing really keeping people inside the building. The whole premise of this space was really for people to mingle outside and to use the outdoor spaces. The bottom right corner is the beach with the bonfires. You can see the 2 bonfire stations. The intention was everybody would kind of spend their time down here. But unfortunately, due to the inclement weather, we all had our umbrellas, we roamed down, but nobody really lingered down in these spaces. So those risks were essentially mitigated just due to weather, but it forced everybody to kind of hang out outside at the food tents and mingle around the exterior spaces of the building. So those are some of the risks that we considered for that. We did also have a fire watch, someone who walked around the space. Music was kept to a certain volume. We did have loudspeakers throughout the space so that people could notify event patrons if there was an event that had to be evacuated. And we also addressed everything in terms of, like I covered previously, like the demographics, right? Everybody here was an adult. We didn't have any vulnerable occupants that we needed to consider. There were mobility concerns. So navigating from kind of the muddy, puddled parking lot across the beach. They had provisions to put mats down to enable accessibility for all spaces. Alcohol was served at the event, but it was controlled. All staff that were serving alcohol were Smart Serve certified, and we have security patrolling the space to deal with any kind of security breaches or events. It was by invite only, so they could control the number of guests attending to this space. And hours. It was an evening event. So as you can understand, lighting was a concern. If all went dark in this kind of dining hall, I don't want to say dining hall, this table area, if all went dark, we wanted to ensure that everybody could evacuate. So we brought in a generator, and all those beautiful Christmas lights that you see, those are actually on emergency power. So they would stay engaged to allow people wayfinding to evacuate the space. We didn't have any exit signs for the space, or they weren't illuminated. If that was, they did have them, but they were decommissioned. So we put up a lot of temporary signs to fill that gap in terms of making sure that people could be aware of where those exit signs were. We also leaned on staff. If you look at the central picture with the Christmas lights in the ceiling, you'll see some green and blue neon colors. Those were also identifying garage doors that could be lifted. So we had designated staff standing adjacent to those spaces that if there were an event, those doors would be lifted up. So again, we're really leaning on our people for these events. But if we're leaning on our people, this is contrary to how our building codes really do operate. We want to ensure that if we're leaning on our people, these are documented and that everybody's aware of their roles and their responsibilities because we cannot put in permanent infrastructure to support these types of events. So this was my Conservation Halton event. I do want to give additional examples of case studies because I want you to think a bit outside the box in terms of how we address these spaces. So some of the other examples that I've come across where we've been working with the design team to achieve an equivalent level of safety for these temporary events. The pandemic response tents. Like I said before, you can't put a hospital in a tent. So we had to develop an engineering solution on how we're going to mitigate all the risks of having vulnerable occupants in a combustible space that's unsprinklered. We weren't running sprinkler pipes across our parking lots to allow for these spaces to be sprinklered. Even fire alarm. We didn't have the infrastructure to run fire alarm wiring and suspend it from the ceiling. Our structure couldn't support that. So we had to come up with alternative solutions that would help address these pandemic response tents. Another example that I did was Holt Renfrew on Bloor. The old HMV space went out of business. And so that space sat vacant for many years. And so Holt Renfrew decided to host an art event in this space. So they had a art gallery on the second floor where they invited guests from outside to come in, but it was a back to base fit out. So all existing building infrastructure was exposed, which does create a hazard as well, right? You've got people playing with insulation and walls, or maybe cutting themselves on a steel joist. So those were all things that we had to be mindful of, and we had to protect this space to make sure that we could use it. And then where do they go for washrooms when they're in kind of a vacant building space? So Holt Renfrew said, okay, well, we'll punch a hole through the wall. They can come in and use our washrooms. It's after hours. So there's nobody going to be in the store. We'll have staff kind of monitor that people don't wander off, and we'll make sure that they can use the washrooms in our space. Another example I did was for Bombardier. They have a large aircraft hangar at Pearson Airport, and they've hosted a few events where they're unveiling a new jet, and they invite the mayor and the public all to come in, and news broadcasters to come in and have this big event where they showcase this. And this is a manufacturing facility. It's not intended to have extra people in that space. So we had to do a life safety study to say how we're going to deal with a lot of those risks. Obviously, we don't want the members of the public wandering off through the manufacturing facility. So we had suspended curtains, which create kind of a flame spread concern, and all of those things had to be addressed for that space. Haunting of Hexwood. This is for any Jack Reacher fans. There's a film set way out in remote North Pickering farm fields. They had, during the pandemic, constructed an old Jack Reacher set, which is essentially a temporary city, and it was used for filming. So everything is just a facade. Everything is combustible. Well, after the pandemic, Jack Reacher film set moved back to Arizona or Texas or wherever they did do their original filming. And so this property sat vacant. So someone came along and said, I want to repurpose this and make this a kind of Halloween event where we're going to use all these buildings as haunted houses. So we got engaged to see how we could use some of these buildings. We're drawing crowds through them. Our floors are not rated. Our floors are really just subfloor plywood on joists. We didn't even know if they were structurally strong enough. So we had to evaluate that and determine how many people could walk through this space at the same time. Haunted houses are always dark. They've got a lot of theatrical equipment and fog machines. All of those things had to be considered to purpose some of these buildings. And we actually deemed some of the buildings not safe for use, and they were not allowed to be part of this event. Toronto District School Board, I just recently did an evaluation for them. They wanted to host an event on their roof. Well, their roof is not necessarily designed for a large occupant load. It is designed for an occupant load. There is a classroom up there and a garden space, but we wanted to put a significant number of people up on this space. So it may have previously only supported 60 people, but we did an evaluation to see, could we have 300 people up there? And again, we don't have washrooms up there. It was for members of the public. So we would have, people needing washrooms who may not be familiar with the building space. And to give an example of one of the compensating measures that we had to do was all of the doors from the roof swung outwards onto the roof. Okay, because we had a lower occupant load. Well, now that we're putting 30 people on there, we have a crowd control concern with crush factor. So we wanted to ensure that this didn't become a risk. Because it's outdoor space, the risks of the integrity of our fire separation for our exit stairs weren't of big concern, because if there's a smoke on the roof, the smoke is just going to dissipate upwards. It's not necessarily going to migrate into our stairs such that they become untenable. So one of our operation protocol was that the staff had to prop open the doors for the event. So for the duration of the event, those exit stair doors were propped open. You will never hear me say that otherwise, okay? This is very specific, and these are always written directly for this event only. We can't even interpret that for the future event. Every event is looked individually. So for this event, yes, I allowed those doors to be propped open, exit stair doors, because that was a better risk than smoke migration into the stair, so that we didn't have those 300 people crushing up on a door and trying to pull it towards us. So that is how I deal with temporary events in spaces and using our buildings for purposes for which they weren't really designed for. I hope that you'll see a lot more of these, with everything that's happening in terms of climate and, the economy. I think we're going to really be repurposing a lot of our spaces, and we might see some of these kind of pop-ups. Pop-ups is becoming now common language. And how do we design for these kind of spaces on a more temporary nature? There are pathways through our code, even though our codes don't necessarily address them well. So I hope everybody has learned something. I do see some questions have come in. Shalika, did you want to say a few words, or did you want me to just jump into questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly remind our attendees that yes, we are shifting into the Q&A portion of the webinar now. We can stay behind 5-10 minutes if we need to, if there's some good discussion, but otherwise, Megan, feel free to go ahead and address those questions.
Usually good. Okay, so the first question, I'm just going to summarize them. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but it came in, is the fire chief obligated to respond in a timely manner so that the event can go ahead as planned? Or is it unwise to have a degree of certainty for the event without prior fire department approval? I always recommend engaging fire services earlier rather than later. Because a life safety study is prescribed under the fire code, it does require approval by fire services. Therefore, better to get them involved earlier. Also be mindful of timeframes. I usually get engaged to do a life safety evaluation about a week prior to the event because most owners and operators don't realize they need it. And when they do realize they need it, it's often too late. It takes me at least 3 or 4 days, if not a week, to prepare these documents, but we still have to go back and forth and negotiate with fire services. So I give the document to fire services. Fire services then has to review it. We still want that pre-incident walkthrough, and we need time to support that. But yes, the fire services, they are obligated to respond to it. They need their approval. In terms of time frame, I can't speak to their time frame, but typically what I find is fire services is always supportive of their community, and they always understand that these are typically community events and they want them to go ahead. So they will, I've not yet had a fire service member not willing to jump through the same hoops that I jumped through. When I was working on that haunting of Hexwood Pickering, we were back and forth with fire services. They were responding to me after hours. We were working under really tight timeframes, but they were willing to jump. So I do find that they're really good about engaging in these processes. This answers actually the second question. How receptive are they to this process? My past experience as an employee is that fire departments were universally hostile to any inquiries whatsoever on any matter. I would frame it as, you don't want to come in and say, we're doing this. What you want to come in and say, we want to host this event. We want to do right. We don't want any risks. We don't want any liability. Please work with us. We think we've identified all of the risks, but if there's anything we've missed, please let us know, because oftentimes those things that are identified are an easy solution. Hire another staff member, put up another sign, put photoluminescent tape along the floor. They're usually Band-Aid easy solutions, but we want all heads at the table because it might be something that you didn't think about, and then the liability and the risk comes to you. So I have found in my experience, fire services is really good about engaging with us on that because it's just pooling resources in this sense. And if you're coming at it with the mindset and the frame of, we want to do right, then they will certainly help you with that process. But if you come in day of the event and say, we're hosting an event tonight, here's my plan, we're good to go, we've thought it all, they're gonna be like, wait a minute, have you? You've never responded to a fire. You've never crawled through a smoky building. Have you thought about this fully? And they may pump the brakes on that. So you want to be respectful of them and give them the time. And if you do that, then you should find that they're very receptive to it. Next question, is there a written code for using grandfathered building, how to be used? You have mentioned so many different tactics, and how do we know what needs to be done for an older building? Okay, I'm not quite clear on that, what the question is, but is there a written code for using grandfathered building? So broadly, building code is applicable to new construction. If you're not touching it, you're not obligated to renovate it. So you can modify 4 to 5 doors and you're not obligated to upgrade the 5th door. That is the premise of the building code. If you modify a door, it has to comply with current code. If you don't touch the door, you don't have to. When it comes to these kind of life safety evaluations for these special events and occasions, we have to think outside the box. The risks, we're trying to mitigate risks. So we're going to be doing construction. There's no line in the sand that says you have to do this, you don't have to do this. It's a creative exercise trying to think of, okay, somebody might trip over that cord. Okay, we're going to put tape down, or we're going to remove that cord and we're going to make sure that that's down. I've leaned on garden hoses for water supply. We've got to think of all of those things and we want to address them. These aren't written down in the code, but at the end of the day, the code really has a fundamental concern with tripping hazards because it's going to delay egress. So you have to think outside the box, okay? In terms of actually following the path of the code, I wouldn't feel comfortable with any event saying, well, the code says I don't have to consider that, because the code does not address these special events in a building. The code addresses your building for which it was originally designed. Okay. Next question. What about the stability of the terrain, land, beach versus shoe types of guests? Were people instructed to wear clothes? Great question. Yes, these are all things that we have to consider. So yeah, it was a muddy area, and I wore sneakers. The event, the theme of that Halton or Conservation Halton event was rustic gala or something to the extent. So I wore sneakers with a dress, and there were a lot of people wearing kind of, stable footwear. It was informed that the terrain was, natural. So we all knew that. We knew there was a beach. They did have flip-flops on site for people, but again, flip-flops are no better than heels when it comes to evacuation. But that is something that you would have to assess. Like, okay, if there is an event, if we've got a really wood splintery floor and people are running across it and, shoes are being taken off, maybe that is something we have to consider. So maybe we put down mats on egress routes, right? Or we carpet a certain area, or, we stabilize the terrain. We bring in some concrete pavers to allow for mobility from one area to the other. Absolutely. We are literally throwing as much as we can at the wall here to kind of address this. And again, the line doesn't blur in terms of how far you take it, because predominantly you have to deal with fire and life safety. That's our biggest risk. But then access, then it bleeds into access, right? You want to make sure that everybody can get through the space and everybody has access to it. If I couldn't get to the beach because I was wearing high heels, it's going to reduce my my happiness on that event, right? And I may not have the best experience. But at the end of the day, the event planner wants the best. They want everybody to have an amazing experience. So all these suggestions like, hey, you may want to consider, how are people, going to get from the maintenance building down to the beach for these beautiful bonfires if they're all wearing heels? So they actually had a runner. They had like a mat that they put down for that. So all of these things can come in. The mandate is that you deal with fire and life safety systems, but you are welcome to expand it beyond and work with that. You guys are the designers. So, working within those to ensure that we have access to everybody. Next question. How does the building owner's insurance play to the event, different uses of the building? To ensure responsibility of informing insurances with the building owner. I can't speak to insurance. This, I assume, would be done through kind of whatever agreement that the event has, with that planner. I believe that certain events planners carry their own insurance for that, but I can't speak to the insurance requirements, but I imagine that would be negotiated, absolutely, and back and forth in terms of what their obligations are if there was an incident or an event with that space. But yeah, it's a good question, and something it's definitely worthwhile asking the question. How is insurance? Who's responsible? Who's liable? And defining that and making sure that the gaps are filled. But that's not my wheelhouse. I am fire protection, life safety, so I can't get beyond that. Next question. Is there a simple geotechnical test for an existing gravel road driveway to confirm if it will support a fire truck? I can't answer that. You'll have to speak to your structural engineer. Not my wheelhouse. I just have to say it has to be sufficient. And then I believe part 4 of the building code prescribes what's actually needed in terms of loads for fire trucks. And I think, Shalika, that was it for questions. Did we have any more questions?
Yes, we still have time. So if you're still working on a question, still working on typing that in the Q&A window, please go ahead. We still have a few minutes.
While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I do also want to ask, I believe you'll get a survey following this presentation. Thank you for your feedback. The most thing that I really want to focus on, though, is at the very bottom of the survey. It asks for, is there anything else you would like to see presented? I have a plethora of knowledge on building code, and I am happy to present to anyone on building code. We can also present on fire code and systems design. So if there's any topics that you think you struggle with, if you could please take the time to put that into the survey, that would be really helpful for us and with OAA in kind of generating future topics for these. Anything is deemed feasible. And if you're thinking it, chances are someone else is thinking it. So please, if you can just take the time, that's the box that we're most critical on in terms of looking and thinking of future presentations. I welcome your ideas. If there's anything that you think you could learn from me, I'm happy to share my knowledge.
Thanks so much for, yes, for plugging the survey, Megan. And as you said, you will be receiving that link shortly after the presentation. Again, if you have any OBC topics that you're interested in, or any other webinar topics as well, you can put that in that box on the survey. Okay, so it doesn't look like any more questions have come. Oh, nope.
Oh, there
One
we
more
go.
question just came in.
Yeah. Okay. So, can light industrial buildings that fabricate wood frame panelized prefab panels be considered temporary if they operate for a few months, or is this considered permanent? That is a very specific question. So, at the end of the day, I'm going to play devil's advocate and I'm going to be the city, and you say, operate for a few months. What's your duration? And you'll notice with all my life safety evaluations, I'm very specific. This event is occurring from 11 till 3 p.m. on Monday, or this event is occurring for this week with tickets being sold for this time slot, this time slot, this time slot. They are very prescriptive in terms of regulating that temporary time frame. I speak to temporary very loosely. It's not a word that the city likes. I don't particularly like it. I'll use my pandemic tents as an example. If you drive around, you will still see some of those temporary hospital tents up. Ottawa Hospital still has their tent up. This is a temporary tent that was constructed under the Emergency Act for the COVID pandemic. The pandemic ended many years ago. The tent is still up. It's a temporary tent. Again, there's no enforcement behind it. So my first step is always, Rachel, to speak to your question, my first step is always to look what's required to make it permanent. Okay, so what infrastructure is needed? Let's look at this building and say, okay, if we're going to make these prefab panels indefinitely, what's needed? We have to do a change of use analysis, perhaps, if it was, F3 to F2. What are the ramifications to do that? And let's look at that. Once we know what's required to support it, we know what the risks are, right? If it's from an F3 to an F2, hypothetically, say you need to sprinkler the building. Okay, well, if we have to sprinkler the building, obviously there's a risk with the combustible load and the combustible content. How are we going to mitigate that risk, right? Maybe it's only in a designated area of the building. Maybe it's got a lot of venting in that area space. And we have to look at different measures that we can apply to support that for those few months. You're also looking at climate. Like, is this a winter thing? Is this a summer thing? Those are going to have very different answers as well, right? But I always look to it as permanent first, which is why I laid out these slide deck as building code requirements, fire code requirements, because we want to look at that first, because that's going to inform the level of risk. And if we can't fill those gaps because of the nature of the event, then maybe we look to other codes and standards under that life safety evaluation. But design as if it were permanent. And then where you struggle with some of incorporating some of those more permanent infrastructure, if you can get a letter from the owner that says, we don't want to sprinkler this building, they're only here for 1 month. Fire services, building department, they're all going to want to see a contract that says 1 month. They're going to want a guarantee from that owner operator that that 1 month is the duration, right? Because again, it comes to that enforcement. Who's kicking them out? Who's stopping construction at that time, right? So I tread cautiously when you use the word temporary. It's a hard sell to the city. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for our attendee for that last question, and thank you, Megan, for addressing that so thoroughly. It looks like that was the last one to come in, so I think I will go ahead and move on to my closing announcements for today. Of course, extending a huge thank you to Megan once again for such an excellent webinar. We love to have you for the OBC. So again, hopefully the attendees here can suggest some more topics for you to come back and talk about.
Thank you.
Thank you again to all of our attendees for your participation and your engagement in today's webinar. So again, a few closing announcements. For those who are seeking continuing education learning hours, a reminder that the OAA will record your participation in this webinar on your OAA transcript, so there is no need for individual reporting on your part. We just kindly ask for your patience, again, at this very busy time of year, as we process and confirm the accreditation of your hours within the next few weeks. Again, attendees are going to soon receive a link to the survey, which we mentioned, and you'll also receive the slides along with that survey. So please do fill out the survey, give some great feedback for Megan, and also fill out that section that lets us know any future webinar topics that you'd be interested in seeing. And finally, a reminder that the 2024-2026 continuing education cycle is coming to a close on June 30th at midnight or 11:59 p.m. And we have just 3 more webinars before then, all of which would count towards your climate action structured learning hours. So next week on Wednesday, June 10th, we have Toronto's Lost Bricks, Improving Deconstruction and Reuse. Thursday, June 11th, we have the Eco Missing Middle, Streetscape, Community High Performance. And then finally, on Thursday, June 18th, we have Innovation in Action at Fanshawe College. So again, those are all climate action webinars. So if you are looking to complete your mandatory 2 climate action hours, be sure to check those out. So with that, I will again thank Megan for this wonderful webinar. Thank you all for your attendance and your participation today. And I hope you have a pleasant remainder of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.